There's a stretch of road out past the dry forks where folks used to slow down just to look at her fence line. Straight as a hymn, every post true. People said you could measure a man's whole life against the way Ruth Calloway kept that fence. She was 96 years old the autumn this happened. Couldn't lift a feed bucket anymore. Couldn't climb into a saddle she'd worn smooth over 70 winters. And one cold Tuesday, with 3 of us standing in the lawyer's office expecting her land to go to the highest bidder, she signed all 1,100 acres over to a man she'd known for exactly 41 days. A broke cowboy. A man with no name worth knowing, no money worth counting, sleeping in his truck with a half-lame donkey tied to the bumper. I was one of the men in that room. I had the cash. I had the better claim by every measure that's supposed to matter. And I'll tell you now, before we go a single step further, that I walked out of there so angry I couldn't see the road. I thought I understood what she'd done. I thought she'd lost her mind to old age and pity. It took me the better part of a year, and one snowstorm I'm not sure any of us should have walked out of, to understand that Ruth Calloway hadn't lost a thing. She'd seen something the rest of us were too busy, too proud, too practical to see. And if you've ever watched someone give away the one thing they had left and wondered whether they were a fool or a saint, stay with me. Because God wasn't finished with that ranch. He wasn't finished with the cowboy. And he sure as anything wasn't finished with me. The morning it started, I was counting Ruth Calloway's days for her in my head, and I'm not proud of it. That's the truth, so let me put it down plain the way I put everything down in the green ledger I keep on the dash of my truck, the one my wife used to tease me about before she passed. October 3, hard frost. Calloway South pasture still ungrazed. Woman can't run it anymore. Talk to her before the Hendricks boys do. My name's Cole Avery. I run the spread that butts up against the old Calloway place on its east line, 800 acres of decent grass, and a creek that goes shy in August. I'd been after Ruth's land for the better part of 6 years, the way a patient man goes after a thing, which is to say without ever quite saying the word land out loud in her kitchen. You didn't push Ruth. You sat. You drank coffee that could strip paint. You waited for her to get to the point, because she always got there before you did, and she usually got there first by half a mile. I'd convinced myself it wasn't greed. I'd convinced myself it was order. That ranch deserved a man who'd keep the fence true, and I was that man, and everybody from the feed store to the church basement knew it. When Ruth went, and at 96, the Lord wasn't exactly making her wait in a long line. The Calloway place ought to come to the fellow next door who'd love it right. That's the man I was on October 3rd. I want you to remember him, because I don't much like him anymore. The drifter showed up on a Thursday. I came over Ruth's cattle guard around 9 to drop off a sack of the cinnamon hard candy she liked, a small kindness, sure, but I won't pretend it didn't have a fence post and 1,100 acres standing behind it, and there was a truck in her yard that I didn't know. Old Ford, the kind of brown that used to be some other color. Bed packed under a tarp, and tied to the back bumper on a length of frayed cotton rope stood the sorriest excuse for livestock I'd ever laid eyes on. A donkey, gray going white around the muzzle, one ear that stood and one that flopped, like it couldn't agree with itself. Ribs you could have played a tune on. It was favoring its off hind leg, resting the hoof tip down in the dust, and when I climbed out of my truck it lifted its head and looked at me with those big, wet, patient eyes that donkeys have, the kind that seem to know something about suffering that you don't. "That yours?" I asked the air because there wasn't anybody else around. A man's voice came back from under Ruth's porch, under it, mind you, where the lattice had rotted loose. "He's nobody's. He just rides with me." Then he crawled out backward, and that was the first I saw of Wade. He was maybe 40, maybe a hard 35, the way the sun and the wind get to a man who spent his nights in a truck cab. Lean to the point of looking carved. He had on a canvas coat worn through at both elbows and a hat that had given up trying to keep its shape years ago. There was old hay in his hair and fresh dirt on his knees, and he was holding, I remember this because it didn't fit anything, a small flashlight in his teeth and a length of copper pipe in his hand. "Pumps froze under the house," he said around the flashlight, then took it out. "Was froze, it's running now. Miss Calloway said it's been dribbling all month. Wasn't froze. Was a cracked elbow joint, but the freeze tonight would have split it the rest of the way and flooded her crawl space." He wiped his hand on his jeans and stuck it out. "Wade. I didn't take it right off. I'm ashamed of that too." "Cole Avery," I said finally. "I farm the East Line. You doing work for Ruth?" "No, sir." He looked back at the donkey, almost apologetic, like the animal had asked him a question. "We were passing through, pulled in to ask if there was day work. She didn't have any, but she's got a porch step about to drop a person and a pump about to flood her foundation, so I figured I'd earn my coffee." "That's it, that's the whole crime that started it. A man fixed a pump for a cup of coffee." I should have seen it for what it was. Instead, I stood in that yard and felt something cold go down my spine, and I told myself it was the frost. It wasn't the frost. Ruth came to the door then, and I want to take a second on Ruth. Because if you only ever picture some frail old woman in a shawl, you'll never understand a word of what's coming. Ruth Calloway was built like a fence post and just about as easy to move. 96, and she still did her own hair, white as creek foam, pinned up under a feed cap. Her hands were ruined knuckles like walnuts, fingers that wouldn't straighten, but her eyes were the clearest blue you ever saw, and when she turned them on you, you had the distinct feeling she could see the part of you that you'd been hiding even from yourself. She'd buried a husband and a son. The husband to a tractor that rolled in 71. The son, and nobody in the county said this above a whisper, to a war on the other side of the world, and they'd sent home a box and a folded flag, and the boy never got a grave on his own ground, which I think hurt Ruth in a place that never healed over. She had no living family that anyone knew of. She had a Bible she'd read to pieces, a border collie named Tuck who was nearly as old as the laws of physics, and 1,100 acres of the best grass in the valley. And she had, that Thursday morning, taken a serious shine to a man who'd crawled out from under her porch. "Cole," she said, seeing me, "you brought my candies." "I did, Ruth." "That's kind." She took the sack. Then she nodded at Wade, who'd already gone back to coiling his rope, already half fixing to leave, the way a man does when he's used to being told to move on. "This is Wade. Wade did my pump. He told me. He won't take money." She said it like an accusation, like it offended her. "Won't take a bed either. Says he sleeps better in the truck." She looked at the donkey, and her ruined face did something soft. "What's the gray one called?" "Solomon," Wade said. Ruth laughed, a real one that turned into a cough. "Solomon, Lord, why?" Wade shrugged, and for the first time something flickered through his careful blankness. "He came with a fellow who couldn't keep him. The fellow said he was the wisest animal he ever owned. Said he wouldn't go one step onto bad ground. Won't cross rotten ice. Won't walk a ledge that won't hold. Pulled this whole truck out of a wash one time when I'd have sworn he couldn't." He scratched the donkey between its mismatched ears. "I figured a creature with that much sense earned a king's name." Ruth was quiet a moment. Then she said something I didn't think much of at the time, and have thought about nearly every day since. "My son," she said, "could never walk onto bad ground either. Knew it in his feet." And she turned and went back inside, and the screen door clapped shut behind her like a period at the end of a sentence. He stayed. Not at her invitation, exactly. Ruth never invited so much as allowed, but the day work he couldn't find anywhere else, he found at the Calloway place, because Ruth Calloway suddenly discovered she had 40 things that needed doing she'd been letting go for years. The barn roof, the well house, the corral that hadn't held a horse since her husband died, but that she wanted standing anyway. Wade did all of it, slow and sure, and every night he slept in his truck down by her gate with Solomon hobbled in the grass, And every morning the donkey would bray once at first light like a cracked trumpet, and you could hear it clear across to my place. I told myself I was watching out for her. An old woman, a strange man, somebody had to keep an eye on things. So I came around more than I used to. And what I saw, over those first weeks, I couldn't fit into the story I'd built. I saw Wade carry Ruth's chair out to the porch every morning so she could watch the light come up, and carry it in every night. I saw him learn, without being told twice, that she took her coffee with 3 sugars and a curse word, and that she wanted to be asked her opinion on things even when there was no decision to make, because being asked made her feel like the ranch was still hers. I saw him sit on her porch step in the evenings and listen to her talk about her boy. Hours of it. The boy at 6, at 16, the boy who could fix anything, the boy who wrote letters home in handwriting so small she'd had to use her husband's reading glass. Wade never said much back. He just listened with his hat in his hands. And once, I saw this from the yard and I'll swear to it. Once when she got to the part about the box and the flag, Wade reached over without a word and put his rough hand over her ruined one, and the two of them sat there in the dark not saying anything at all. I'd known Ruth 20 years. I'd brought her candy and coffee and patient conversation, and the whole time I'd been measuring her acreage in my head. This stranger had been there a month, and he was holding her hand, while she cried about a boy who'd been dead since before he was born. I drove home that night and I didn't write a word in my ledger. I just sat in the dark of my own kitchen and felt something I didn't have a name for, something that tasted like shame and grief mixed together, and I told myself it was indigestion. It wasn't indigestion either. The first time I understood there was real trouble coming was at the feed store, 3 weeks in. I was at the counter when I heard the Hendricks brothers in the next aisle. The Hendricks boys ran a big operation 2 valleys over, corporate-minded, leveraged to the eyeballs, the kind of outfit that bought land the way other men bought lunch. They'd had their eye on Ruth's ground for years, same as me, except where I was a neighbor with a ledger, they were a balance sheet with a lawyer. Getting senile, my point is, the younger one was saying. Some drifters moved in on her. Word is he's got her wrapped around his finger. Then we move now, the older said. Before the drifter does. Old woman like that's got no people. Get her in front of an attorney, make her an offer she can't think straight enough to refuse. I set down my sack of mineral, and I walked around that aisle, and I don't fully remember what I said. But I remember the older Hendricks's face going from surprise to ugly. And I remember the words, "You're no different than us. Avery. You've been circling that land for years, hitting me square in the chest because they were true." I drove out to Ruth's that same evening. I told myself it was to warn her, and it was. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a smaller, meaner voice underneath, saying, "Get there first." Ruth was on her porch with a quilt over her knees, and Wade was up on a ladder against the barn, nailing the last of the new roofing on against a sky going copper and red. Solomon stood at the base of the ladder, ears swiveled up, watching the man overhead like a worried parent. The whole scene was so peaceful it made what I'd come to say feel like throwing a rock through a window. "Ruth," I said, "need to talk to you about the land." She didn't look surprised. Ruth never looked surprised. "I figured you'd get to it eventually, Cole. You've been getting to it for 6 years. She patted the chair beside her. "Sit." I said. "The Hendricks brothers are coming for your ground," I said. "Heard them planning it today. They mean to rush you in front of a lawyer while they think you're—" I caught the word senile in my teeth and swallowed it. "While they think they can, I came to tell you, and to say, here it was. Here was the whole reason I'd circled this woman like a hawk for 6 years. To say that if you're ever of a mind to sell, you ought to sell to me. I'd keep it right. You know I would. I've got the cash. I'd give you a fair number, and you could live out your days right here in this house. And when I'm dead," Ruth said. I wasn't going to say it like that. "It's the only honest way to say it, Cole." She wasn't angry, that was the worst part. She looked at me the way you look at a child who's done something you expected and forgave in advance. You've been a good neighbor, you brought me candy, you came around, and every time you came around I watched you look at my grass. She said it gently. I'm old, Cole, I'm not blind, I never was. I couldn't say anything. There was a hammer ringing up on the barn, slow and steady, Wade driving nails one at a time, and Solomon shifted his weight in the dust, and the sun went down a little more. I don't fault you for it, Ruth went on. Wanting land is just wanting to last. I understand that better than anybody. My whole life was wanting this place to last. She looked out across it, 1,100 acres going blue in the dusk. But I've been asking the Lord a question for 2 years now, Cole, every night. I've been asking him what this place is for now that there's no Calloway left to leave it to, and I never got an answer. She turned those clear blue eyes on me. Till about a month ago. Up on the barn, the hammering stopped. I felt the cold go down my spine again, and this time I didn't blame the frost. I should tell you about the night the boy's name came up, because it changed everything, and I'm not sure to this day whether what happened was chance or whether Ruth was right about who was running the thing. It was the second week of November. A storm was building up north, you could smell it, that flat metal smell that comes before real snow, and I'd come over to help Wade get Ruth's old hay under cover before it hit. We worked till dark, the two of us and Solomon, the donkey hauling a sledge of loose bales across the yard because Ruth's tractor had been dead since the Carter administration. Wade worked like a man paying off a debt he couldn't name. I'd stopped pretending to myself that he was after the land. Whatever Wade was after, it wasn't acreage. A man after acreage doesn't reset an old woman's porch step so it won't drop her, then refuse to be paid for it. When we finished, Ruth called us in for supper. Stew and biscuits, her hands shaking too bad now to do much, but she'd done it anyway, and we ate at her table under a photograph of a young man in uniform that I'd seen 100 times and never really looked at. That night I looked. 20 years old maybe, garrison cap, a grin like he was about to say something funny, and under the photo, in Ruth's ruined hand, a strip of tape with a name and 2 dates that were too close together. Daniel Calloway. I watched Wade go still when he read it. I watched him set down his spoon. Ruth, he said, and his voice had changed. What unit was your boy in? She told him. And Wade put his face in his hands, right there at the table, this hard carved drifter who hadn't shown one soft thing in a month except for the way he held an old woman's hand, and his shoulders started to shake. And Ruth and I sat there not understanding. And when he finally got his face back up, it was wet and he looked at her like she'd risen up out of the photograph herself. I knew him, Wade said. Ma'am, Ruth, I knew Daniel. We came up through the same. He stopped, pulled himself together with a visible effort like hauling a wagon up a grade. We weren't in it together at the end, but before, he talked about this place every single day. The straight fence, the grass that goes blue at dusk, the donkey his daddy had that wouldn't cross bad ice. He laughed broken. I didn't put it together. Calloway's a common enough name out here. But I bought Solomon off a man 2 states over, and I've been drifting ever since I got out. And I drove down a road I had no reason to drive down, and I pulled into a yard I had no reason to pull into, to ask for work I didn't expect to find. He couldn't finish. Ruth had gone white as her own hair. Her ruined hands were pressed flat on the table like she was trying to hold it down. You knew my Daniel, she whispered. Yes, ma'am. You came down my road. Yes, ma'am. I can't tell you why. I just turned in. And Ruth Calloway, 96 years old, who had buried a husband and a son, and asked the Lord for 2 years what her land was for, and never gotten an answer. Ruth Calloway started to cry the way you cry when something you'd given up hopping for walks in your front door, and she reached across that table and took the drifter's face in both her ruined hands, and she said the thing that I have never once been able to forget. He sent you home to me, she said. I asked him, and he sent my boy's friend home to me to do it. I sat in that warm kitchen with the storm coming, and I felt the whole shape of the world I'd built, the ledger, the acreage, the patient circling, the man I'd been on October 3rd. I felt all of it crack right down the middle like a pump elbow that's been waiting all month for one hard freeze. I'd come for the land. I was sitting at the table where the land had just decided who it belonged to, and it wasn't me. And for the first time in 6 years, I found that I didn't care about the land at all. I cared that an old woman had stopped being alone. The snow came that night. First real storm of the year, 8 inches by morning, and it laid down over the Calloway place white and clean and total, and it buried the new barn roof Wade had nailed down just in time, and it buried the straight fence till you could only see the tops of the posts marching off true toward the dry forks. I drove home through it slow, gripping the wheel, my green ledger sliding around on the dash. When I got to my own dark kitchen, I took the ledger inside for the first time in 20 years. I sat down at my table where there's nobody across from me anymore. And under the entry from October 3rd, woman can't run it anymore. Talk to her before the Hendricks boys do, I wrote one line. I was wrong about what it's for. I didn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the storm and thinking about a man who turned down a road for no reason, and a donkey that won't walk onto bad ground. And somewhere toward morning I started to wonder, the way you wonder about things at 3 a.m., whether Ruth was right. Whether God was in the business of turning trucks down empty roads. Whether he was finished. I had a powerful feeling lying there that he wasn't. I didn't know the half of it yet. I didn't know that the Hendricks brothers had already made their move, that there was a letter from a lawyer sitting in Ruth's mailbox under 4 inches of snow, and that within a week the three of us, the old woman, the drifter, and the neighbor who'd finally figured out what he was, would be standing in a cold office watching a will get sign that broke my heart and saved it in the same minute. But that's part two. Outside the snow kept coming. And down at Ruth's gate, hobbled in the white, Solomon lifted his head into the storm and brayed once, that cracked, broken trumpet sound, like he knew something none of us did. The letter had been sitting in Ruth's mailbox for 4 days before any of us thought to dig it out from under the snow. That's the thing nobody tells you about a hard winter. It doesn't just bury the fences. It buries the news. Wade found the envelope the morning after the storm broke, frozen to the inside of the mailbox, so he had to thaw it with his bare hands before it had come loose, and he carried it up to the house already knowing, the way you know, that it was the kind of paper that changes things. I was there. I'd come over at first light to help shovel Ruth's walk and check her propane, and I won't pretend that was the whole reason. The truth is I couldn't stay away anymore. Something had got hold of me at that supper table the night the boy's name came up, and it hadn't let go, and a man who'd spent 6 years counting an old woman's days now found he couldn't get through his own morning without driving over to make sure she'd survived the night. Ruth read the letter at her kitchen table with her reading glass. Her husband's old reading glass, the one her boy used to borrow, and I watched her face, and her face didn't change at all, which was how I knew it was bad. "They've gone and done it," she said. "Done what, Ruth?" She slid the paper across the table. The Hendricks brothers hadn't come themselves. Men like that never do. They'd sent a lawyer, and the lawyer had sent a letter, and the letter was a thing of such smooth and lawyerly cruelty that I had to read it twice to find the knife in it. It opened with concern. That was the genius of it. It expressed concern for Mrs. Calloway's well-being, a woman of her advanced years, living alone, isolated by weather, recently joined by an unrelated transient male of unknown background. It noted that the county had a duty to protect vulnerable elders from undue influence. It suggested, in the gentlest possible terms, that a competency evaluation might be in everyone's interest. And it concluded, here was the knife, by reminding Mrs. Calloway that the Hendricks Land Group remained ready to make a generous offer for her property at any time, an offer that would relieve her of the burdens of management and ensure her comfort and security for whatever time she had remaining. Whatever time she had remaining. They'd put it in writing. They'd threatened to have a 96-year-old woman declared incompetent, to take her ranch away through a judge, and in the same breath offered to buy it from her, and they dressed the whole filthy thing up in the language of care. I set the letter down. My hands weren't steady. "They can't do this," I said. "Ruth, this is theft wearing a tie." "They can try." Ruth folded the letter back along its creases neat the way she did everything. "And they might win, Cole. That's the part you don't understand because you've never been old. When you get to be my age, the world starts to treat your mind like it's already half gone. You forget where you set your glasses one time and a young person decides you can't be trusted with your own life." Her jaw was set hard. "They'll find a doctor. They'll find a judge. They'll bring in some county woman to ask me what year it is, and what's my name, and do I know who the president is. And the whole time what they'll really be asking is, can we take your land? And if I get one answer wrong." "You won't get one answer wrong. I'm 96, Cole." For just a second, something flickered in her, not fear. Ruth didn't do fear, but the thing under fear. "Some mornings I wake up and it's 1962. It only lasts a minute, but it lasts a minute." Wade had been standing by the stove this whole time, dead quiet, his hat in his hands. Now he spoke. "Then we don't give them time to find a judge," he said. "We go first." The lawyer's office was in town, 40 minutes off when the roads were clear, which they weren't. Wade drove. He'd put chains on his old Ford the night before, and he took the icy grade slow and steady. And Ruth sat between us on the bench seat wrapped in her quilt with her Bible in her lap. And Solomon, because Ruth had flatly refused to leave him behind, "That animal goes where Wade goes," she'd said. "And Wade goes where I need him." Solomon rode in the truck bed under the tarp, and every so often you'd hear his hooves shift on the metal as we took a turn. Nobody talked much. There wasn't much to say that the situation hadn't already said for us. I'll tell you what I was thinking, though, because it shames me, and because it's the hinge the whole story turns on. I was thinking I could still get the land. God forgive me, but it's true. Some small reptile part of my brain, the part that had been running the numbers for 6 years, looked at this whole disaster and saw a door. The Hendricks boys were threatening Ruth with a competency fight. Ruth was scared. A scared old woman in a corner sells to the neighbor she trusts, sells to me, to keep it out of the hands of the people threatening her. I had the cash. I could solve her whole problem with one check and the land would be mine, and I'd even be the hero of it. I sat in that truck, with that good and trusting woman pressed warm against my shoulder, and I let myself think that thought all the way to town. I'm telling you so you understand what it cost me to do what I did next. The lawyer was a woman named Prout, old Hal Prout's daughter, taken over his practice when his eyes went, and she was younger than I'd have liked but sharper than I'd feared. She read the Hendricks letter while we sat in her cramped, warm office with the radiator clanking, and her mouth got thinner and thinner, and when she finished she set it down and said a word I won't repeat in front of an audience that skews church-going, and then she apologized to Ruth for saying it. "This is intimidation," Prout said. "It's ugly and it's beneath the bar, and I've half a mind to report the attorney who drafted it, but—" She took her glasses off. "Mrs. Calloway, I have to be honest with you. Because you don't strike me as a woman who wants comfortable lies. They're not entirely bluffing. A competency challenge is a real proceeding. If they file it, you'd have to defend it, and at your age, with no family to vouch for you and an unrelated man recently moved onto your property, the optics are bad. Not impossible, but bad. It could drag a year. It could cost more than you've got in cash. And the whole time, your land would be tangled up in court and you couldn't sell it, gift it, or will it cleanly to anyone." "So what do I do?" Ruth said. "You make your wishes legally airtight now, while there's not yet a filing against you, while no court has any reason to question your judgment." Prout leaned forward. "If you have a clear intention for this property, if you know exactly who you want it to go to and why, we put it down today, in front of witnesses, with a competency affidavit signed by a doctor this afternoon if I can get Dr. Osai to come over. Once it's done and witnessed and notarized and you're on record as sound, it becomes very, very hard for anyone to unwind it. The Hendricks group would be trying to overturn the documented wishes of a woman 3 doctors and a notary all say was perfectly clear. They won't spend the money. It's not worth it to them. They'll move on to easier prey. She spread her hands. But it only works if you're certain. Are you certain, Mrs. Calloway? Do you know who you want to have your ranch? And here it was. This was the moment the reptile in my brain had been driving toward for 40 icy minutes. Ruth would say my name. She had to. I was the safe choice, the cash choice, the neighbor she'd known 20 years, the man who could close it today and end her fear. I felt my own heartbeat in my ears. I had my checkbook in my coat. I could have it done by supper time. Ruth turned, but she didn't turn to me. She turned to Wade. I wanted to go to him, Ruth said. The radiator clanked. Outside the window the snow had started up again, soft and slow. Wade went the color of ash. Ruth. Don't Ruth me. Her voice cracked like a whip, the old rancher coming up through the old woman. I've made up my mind, and I made it up 2 weeks ago at my own kitchen table, and I've been waiting on the Lord to send me a reason to do it sooner, and he sent me the Hendricks boys, so here we are. She turned to Prout. Wade Holloway, he's to have it all. The house, the barn, the 1,100 acres, the equipment such as it is, the cattle, the water rights, the mineral rights, all of it. Free. Not sold, given. Ruth, I can't take your land. You're not taking anything, I'm giving it. She reached over and gripped his forearm with one ruined hand, and her grip must have hurt because I saw him wince. Listen to me, son. You think I'm doing this for you. I'm not. I'm doing it for me, and for my husband, and for my Daniel, who never got to come home and work this ground he loved so much he wrote about it in letters from the other side of the world. I have asked God for 2 years what this place was for. And he sent me a man who knew my boy, a man who turns down empty roads, a man who won't take a dollar he didn't earn and sleeps in a truck rather than impose on an old woman. That's who Daniel would have been if the world had let him grow old. That's who I want walking my fence line when I'm gone. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was iron. You will take this land, Wade Holloway, and you will keep the fence true, and you will let an old woman die knowing her grass went to somebody who will love it the way her boy would have. That is the only thing left in this world I want. Do not you dare deny me. The room was dead silent. And I sat there, with my checkbook in my coat and the reptile in my brain going quiet, going still, going finally and forever quiet, and I felt something break open in my chest that I can only describe as relief. A relief so total it frightened me. Like setting down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was a weight, forgotten my own back was bent under it. I'd wanted that land for 6 years. And watching Ruth give it to a drifter, I felt nothing but glad. That's how I knew, finally and for certain, that I'd become a different man than the one who'd written in his ledger on October 3rd. Not because I'd decided to be. I hadn't decided anything. It had been done to me, slow, over 6 weeks, by a brave old woman and a quiet man and a donkey that wouldn't cross bad ice, and I'd had about as much say in it as a field has in the rain. Wade had his face in his hands again. Why me? He said, muffled. Ruth, there's nothing, I've got nothing, I am nothing, I'm a man who sleeps in a truck, I can't even keep a... That's exactly why, Ruth said quietly. A man with everything doesn't know what land is for, a man with nothing does. She let go of his arm and sat back spent, suddenly looking every one of her 96 years. Now sign the man's papers, Wade, and Cole. She turned to me at last, and there was something in her face that told me she'd known the whole time what I'd been thinking on that drive, every shabby inch of it, and had forgiven me before I'd even thought it. Cole, you'll witness. I'd be honored if you would. There's nobody whose name I'd rather have on it next to his. I had to clear my throat twice before I could answer. I'd be honored, Ruth, I said. And I meant it with everything I had. Dr. Osai came that afternoon, chains on his tires and his bag in his hand, and he sat with Ruth for an hour in Prout's office, and asked her the year and her name and the president and 100 other things. And Ruth answered every one of them sharp as a tack. And then, because Ruth was Ruth, she finished by telling Dr. Osei exactly what she thought of the Hendricks brothers in language that left no doubt whatsoever about the soundness of her mind. He signed the affidavit smiling. Prut drew up the deed of gift. She drew it careful and tight, every clause locked, and she had me read it twice as witness, and I read it, and I want to tell you about the part that got me. There was a clause near the end that Ruth had insisted on. It said the land could never be sold to a corporation, never subdivided, never developed. It said that if Wade ever, for any reason, could no longer keep it, the land was to pass to another working rancher who would keep it whole and keep it grass. And it named the conditions so tight that the Hendricks brothers of the world could never get their hands on it, not in this generation or the next. And it said, this is the part. It said that there was to be a marker set on the high ground of the south pasture, where the grass goes blue at dusk, in memory of Daniel Calloway, who loved this ground from far away and never got to come home to it. A grave of a kind, the grave on his own ground that Ruth had never been able to give him. I read that clause standing in a lawyer's cramped office with the snow coming down, and I had to turn and look out the window for a minute, so the two of them wouldn't see my face. Wade signed. His hand was shaking so bad the first letter came out wrong, and Prut had to give him a fresh page. Ruth signed, firm and sure, her ruined hand making the same Calloway signature she'd made on her marriage license 70-some years before. And I signed as witness Cole Avery, the man who came for the land and stayed for the grace of it, and Prut notarized it and stamped it, and it was done. 1,100 acres, given away, to a man who'd had it for 41 days. And I have never in my life been part of anything that felt so much like church. We came out of Prut's office into the early dark of a winter afternoon, snow falling slow and fat under the streetlights, and Solomon was waiting in the truck bed exactly where we'd left him. And when he saw Wade, he lifted his head and brayed once, that cracked, broken trumpet, and the sound bounced off the brick storefronts and came back doubled, and a couple coming out of the diner stopped to stare. Ruth laughed, first time all day. He approves, she said. We got her settled in the cab. Wade went around to crank the engine, and I stood there a second in the falling snow next to the truck bed, and I did something I'd never done. I reached up and scratched that ugly gray donkey between his mismatched ears, and he leaned into it, warm and heavy, his breath coming out in clouds. You knew, I told him quiet so the others wouldn't hear me talking to a donkey like a fool. Whole time, you knew where the bad ice was and you knew where the good ground was and you walked him right down the only road in the county that mattered. I scratched him again. Solomon, King's name. Yeah, all right. He blew out a breath against my coat. I climbed in. Wade got us turned around and pointed home, slow on the chains, the wipers ticking the snow off the glass. And Ruth fell asleep between us before we cleared the town limits, her head against Wade's shoulder. Her Bible slid down into her lap, her ruined hands finally still. Wade drove like he was carrying something holy, which I suppose he was. You all right? I asked him low. He didn't answer for a long time. The road unspooled white in the headlights. I keep thinking, he finally said, about how I almost didn't turn in. That first day, I'd already passed her road. I was 100 yards down the highway and I told myself there's no work here, keep going, there's never any work, and Solomon planted his feet in the trailer and wouldn't settle, started kicking the boards. I figured he needed water, so I turned around to find him a creek. He shook his head slowly, eyes on the snow. I turned around for a donkey's water, Cole. That's the whole reason, that's the only reason. And now, his voice went, he swallowed it down. Now I've got a home, first one since I was a kid, and a woman who looks at me like I'm her boy come back. And I don't know what I did to deserve any of it. I didn't do anything, I fixed a pump. You fixed a pump, I agreed. And you held her hand when she cried. And you listened to her talk about Daniel for a month of nights when you could have been sleeping. You did plenty, Wade. You did the only things that ever actually matter and don't cost a dime. I looked over at Ruth, asleep and at peace between us. She's right, you know, about what the land's for. Took me 6 years and watching you to see it. It's not for the man who can run the numbers. It's for the man who will sit on the porch step in the dark and let an old woman not be alone. We drove the rest of the way without talking. There wasn't any need. I dropped them at Ruth's gate and helped Wade walk her inside, and we got her into her chair by the stove with Tuck the old collie groaning down at her feet, and she woke up just enough to pat Wade's cheek and say good night, son. And I tell you that word son landed in that warm kitchen like a blessing. I drove home alone through the dark and the falling snow, and the whole valley was white and silent, and the only mark on it was the straight line of Ruth's fence posts marching off toward the dry forks, and I thought, it's done. She's safe. The Hendricks boys lost. The good man won the land, and the old woman got her peace, and her boy's going to have a marker on the high ground at last. It's done, and it ended right, and thank God. I got home and took out my green ledger, and I sat at my table where there's nobody across from me. And under the line, I'd written the night of the first storm. I was wrong about what it's for. I wrote a new one. Witnessed the deed today. She gave it all to Wade. I've never seen anything so right in my life. It's finished. I want you to look hard at that last word. Finished. Because I was certain of it. I drove home certain. I wrote it down certain. The story was over. Good had won, evil had slunk off. The deed was signed and stamped and notarized and locked. There was nothing left to do but watch Wade keep the fence true and watch Ruth live out her days in peace. That's what I believed, sitting at my table that snowy night with my pen in my hand. I was wrong about that too. Because 3 things were coming that none of us saw, not me, not Wade, not even Ruth with her clear blue eyes that saw everything. The Hendricks brothers were not, it turned out, done. Ruth had a secret she hadn't told a living soul, not the lawyer, not the doctor, not Wade, a secret about her own health that would change everything inside a month. And out on that high south pasture where the grass goes blue, where Wade would soon set a marker for a boy who never came home, the ground itself was about to give up something that had been buried under that grass for 60 years. Something Ruth's husband had put there. Something that would tell us all, once and for all, whether an old woman had been right about a God who turns trucks down empty roads. But that's part 3. Outside my window, the snow kept falling, soft and total, burying the fence posts 1 inch at a time. And somewhere down at Ruth's gate, Solomon stood in the white with his breath clouding the dark, his one good ear turned toward the high south pasture, listening, the way he always seemed to be listening, to something the rest of us couldn't hear yet. I'll put that down first, plain, the way Ruth would have wanted it, because there's no sense making you wait through this whole part dreading a thing I can just tell you now. Ruth Calloway died in May, in her own bed in her own house, on her own ground, with the windows open and the grass coming green, and a man she called son holding one of her ruined hands while I held the other. It was the gentlest death I ever saw. It was the way you'd want to go if you'd earned it, and she had. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and that's not how Ruth told a story. Ruth made you sit. Ruth made you wait, so sit. Because between the snowy night the deed got signed and the green morning she let go, there was a winter to get through. And that winter held all 3 of the things I told you were coming. The secret, the Hendricks boys' last filthy move, and the thing the ground gave up on the high south pasture. Let me take them the way they came. The secret came first, and it came on a gray afternoon in December, and it came to me by accident, which is the only way Ruth would ever have let it come at all. I'd driven over with a load of split firewood. Wade was off in town getting Ruth's prescriptions filled. She had a heart pill she took, and a water pill, ordinary old age things, nothing that had ever worried anybody, and Ruth was alone in the house except for Tuck the old collie, and I came in stamping snow off my boots and found her sitting very still at her kitchen table with a letter in front of her. Not the Hendricks letter, a different one, thinner paper, a clinic's name in the corner. She tried to fold it away when she heard me, but her ruined hands were too slow, and I saw enough. "Ruth," I said, "what's that?" "Nothing for you to fuss about." "Ruth." She looked at me a long moment. Then she sighed, the way you sigh when you've decided to set a weight down, and she pushed the letter across the table the same way she'd pushed the Hendricks letter across a month before. It was from her doctor, from October, before any of this started. She'd gone in for the dizzy spells, the morning she woke up, and it was 1962. And the letter, in the careful, bloodless language those letters always use, told her that what she had was not going to get better, and that it was not in her heart or her water but in her mind, and that it would take from her slowly and then all at once, and that she ought to make arrangements while she still could. October, she'd known since October. She'd known before Wade ever pulled into her yard. I sat down hard in the chair across from her. The whole shape of the thing reorganized itself in my head, and it about took my breath. "That's why," I said. "That's why you moved so fast on the deed. That's why you wanted it done now in front of the doctor on record sound, because you knew there was a clock on how long you'd be able to prove you were sound at all." I stared at her. "Ruth, the Hendricks letter didn't scare you because they might win. It scared you because they might be right, about the part you'd never have admitted to a living soul." "Don't you say that," she said sharply. "I am sound today. Dr. Osa put his name to it. I knew exactly what I was doing when I gave that boy my land, and I'd do it again right now." Then the iron went out of her, and what was underneath was so tired and so honest it hurt to look at. "But you're right that I was racing something, Cole. I just wasn't racing the Hendricks boys. I was racing that." She nodded at the letter. "I had to get it done while I was still all here. While it was still my choice and not something a court decided about a woman who couldn't remember her own boy's name." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "I'm so afraid of that. Of the day I look at Wade and don't know him. I can stand dying, Cole. I've been ready to die for 30 years. What I can't stand is the idea of being here and gone at the same time. Of him having to take care of a stranger who used to be me." I reached across and took her hand. I'd never done that before. Wade had done it 100 times, and I'd watched him do it and envied him the easy grace of it. And now I did it myself, clumsy, and her ruined fingers closed around mine. "Does Wade know?" I asked. "No, and you won't tell him." Her grip tightened. "Promise me, Cole. Let me have whatever good days are left without him watching me like a clock. Let him just have his Ruth till the day I'm not. That's all I want. Promise me." I promised her. I kept it too. It's one of the hardest things I ever did. Watching Wade love her easy and unguarded all that winter, not knowing what was coming. While I knew, but I kept it. Because it was the last thing she ever asked of me. And because some promises you make to a dying woman are the truest things you'll ever do. The Hendricks boys made their last move in January, and I'll give it to you quick, because it doesn't deserve the room a good thing deserves. They filed anyway. Prude had said they wouldn't bother once the deed was signed and witnessed, and the competency affidavit was on record, said it wasn't worth their money to fight 3 doctors and a notary. But she'd underestimated how much men like that hate to lose, and how cheap spite is when you've got a lawyer on retainer. They filed a petition contesting the gift, claimed undue influence, claimed Wade was a con man who'd targeted a vulnerable widow, dragged his whole drifting history into the daylight, every odd job, every town he'd left, every nothing he'd ever been, and made it sound, in the way a good lawyer can, like the resume of a predator. It hurt Wade. I won't pretend it didn't. He read the filing in Prute's office and he went gray and quiet, and that night he came to me, not to Ruth, to me, and he said low, "Maybe they're right, Cole. Maybe I should never have let her. Maybe a man like me's got no business with 1,100 acres, and I'm just what they say I am, a fellow who showed up and took an old woman's land." And I grabbed him by the coat, first and only time I ever laid hands on him. "You listen to me," I said. I'm the one man in this county who knows what taking that land looks like because I spent 6 years planning to do it. I had the cash and the claim and the patience, and I circled that woman like a buzzard and called it being neighborly. That's what a land taker looks like, Wade. It looks like me. It does not look like a man who fixed a pump for a cup of coffee and won't sign the deed without crying. I let him go. Daniel's mother gave you her grass because you're the only person who ever wanted her more than her ground. Don't you let those two snakes in town tell you different. Don't you dare. He didn't say anything, but he stood up straighter. We fought it. Prout fought it like a badger. And in the end it went the way Prout had always said it would. Dr. Osa testified. The notary testified. Prout put me on the stand, and I told the court under oath about the man I'd been on October 3rd, and the thing I'd watched happen at a kitchen table. And a judge who'd known Ruth Calloway 40 years looked at the Hendricks brothers over his glasses and threw the whole petition out with language that made their lawyer flinch. They left the county that summer, sold their leveraged operation to pay their debts, and moved on to wherever men like that go. I'd love to tell you that's the part that mattered. It isn't. It was never about them. They were just the wind that made the old woman move fast. The story was never the Hendricks boys. The story was on the high south pasture. It was March when the ground gave it up. The thaw had come early and hard, the way it does some years, and the snowmelt ran off the high ground in sheets and cut new little gullies in the south pasture where the grass goes blue at dusk. The high ground where, come summer, Wade meant to set the marker for Daniel. He was up there one afternoon walking the line of where he'd put it, trying to find the right spot, the spot with the best light at dusk, and Solomon was up there with him grazing the new grass, and I was down at the house helping Ruth. She was having a good day, a sharp day, sitting on her porch in the first real sun of the year with her face turned up to it like a flower. We heard Wade shout. Not a hurt shout, something else. And then we saw him coming down off the high ground at a dead run, and Solomon coming behind him at that rocking donkey gallop, and Wade had something in his hands, and he was running like a boy. And when he got close enough I could see his face, and his face was lit up like I'd never seen it. He came up onto the porch out of breath, and he knelt down in front of Ruth's chair, and he set the thing in her lap with his dirt-black hands. It was a tin box, an old ammunition tin, the kind that seals tight, rusted on the outside but whole. The thaw gully had cut down right alongside it and tipped it half out of the ground where it had sat buried under that blue grass for, we'd work out later, almost 60 years. It was on the high ground, Wade said, breathless. Right where I was going to set Daniel's marker, right exactly there, Ruth. The water cut down and there it was. There's a name scratched on the lid. Look at the lid. Ruth looked at the lid. And Ruth Calloway, who I had never once seen frightened, started to shake. Scratched into the metal in a hand she knew better than her own were 2 words and nothing else. For Ruth. That's Tom's hand, she whispered. Tom, her husband, dead since 1971, the tractor that rolled. That's my Tom's hand. He buried that on the high ground and he never, she couldn't finish. Her ruined hands were trembling too hard to work the latch. Wade opened it for her, gentle as anything, and lifted the lid. I'm going to tell you what was in the box, but first I have to tell you that I don't fully understand it to this day, and I've stopped trying, because Ruth was right and I was wrong, and there are some things that aren't ours to understand, only to witness. There were letters on top. Daniel's letters, the ones he'd written home from the other side of the world, the small handwriting, the ones Ruth had read with her husband's reading glass until the paper went soft. But not all of them. These were different. These were letters Daniel had written that Ruth had never seen because they'd never made it to her. They'd come addressed to his father, to Tom, man to man. The things a boy says to his father and not his mother, about being scared, about what he'd seen, about wanting more than anything in the world to come home and work the grass and someday have a boy of his own to teach the way his daddy taught him. And the last one, The last one was dated 2 weeks before the box came home instead of the boy. In it, Daniel asked his father to do something for him in case. In case, he'd written, "The way young men at war learn to write." He'd asked Tom, if the worst came, to bury something on the high south ground where the grass goes blue, and to leave it for whoever came after, because somebody will come after, Dad. Somebody always does. And the land doesn't care about us, it only cares that we keep it whole. And he'd asked Tom to put in the box the one thing Daniel owned that he wanted passed on. The thing under the letters. Under the letters was a folded flag. Not Daniel's burial flag, that one Ruth had on her mantle, had stared at for 60 years. A second one. The flag from Daniel's unit, the one his men had signed in the field before he died, every name in faded ink across the white stripes, men who'd loved her boy and wanted his mother to know it. And Tom had gotten it somehow, God knows how, through what channels, a grieving father pulling what strings a rancher can pull, and Tom had been too broken to give it to Ruth and too faithful to throw it away. So he'd done the only thing a man like Tom could do. He'd buried it on the high ground, with the letters in a sealed tin, for Ruth. And then he'd gotten on his tractor a few weeks later, and the tractor had rolled. And Tom Calloway had died with the secret of the high south pasture locked up in his chest, and the grass had grown blue over it for 55 years. Until a drifter turned down an empty road for a donkey's water. Until that same drifter went up the high ground to find the right spot to set a marker for the very boy who'd asked for the box to be buried there in the first place. Until the thaw cut down in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. In the one spring there was anyone left who'd understand what it meant. Ruth held the signed flag in her ruined hands and read the names of the men who'd loved her son, and she didn't cry. She'd gone past crying. She just looked up at the high ground, at the blue grass, at the sky over it, and her clear blue eyes were the clearest I ever saw them. And she said to the sky, to Tom, to Daniel, to the one she'd been arguing with for 2 years, she said, "I told you he wasn't finished." She started to go downhill in April. The good days got fewer. The mornings in 1962 got longer. And true to the thing she'd been most afraid of, there came a morning when she looked at Wade across the breakfast table, and for a few terrible minutes didn't know him, called him Daniel, asked him why he was in his work clothes, said he'd be late for school. Wade didn't flinch. I'll love him forever for that. He just smiled and poured her coffee with 3 sugars and said, "Yes, Mama, I'm going," and let her have it. Let her have her boy at the table one more morning. And when she came back to herself an hour later, confused and frightened, he held her hand and told her she'd dozed off, and that was all. I dreaded that day for her sake, and it came, and she got through it because she didn't get through it alone. That was the whole point. That was what the land had been for. Not the grass, not the acres, not the water rights the Hendricks boys had hungered after. A man at the table so she didn't have to be gone and alone at the same time. She let go in May, like I told you at the start. Windows open, grass green. May holding one hand and Wade the other, and tucked the old collie at her feet, and somewhere out in the yard Solomon braying once at the first light, that cracked broken trumpet and Ruth's last clear words. She had a clear hour, right at the end, the way some people do. Her last clear words were to Wade. "Keep the fence true," she said. "I will." And set my boy's marker on the high ground, where Tom put the box. That's the spot, that was always the spot. She squeezed his hand. "And son." "Yes, Ruth." "You came home," she said. "You finally came home." And she closed her eyes, and a little while after that she stopped, gentle as a held breath let go, and the room was very quiet, and the curtains moved in the spring air, and that was all. Wade set the marker in June on the high south ground, where the grass goes blue at dusk. A single granite stone, Daniel's name, the 2 dates that were too close together, and under them, because Wade asked me what to put and I knew the second I heard the question, the line from Daniel's last letter. "The land doesn't care about us. It only cares that we keep it whole." We buried the signed flag with the box again. Right there beneath the stone, Wade's idea, and the right one. It came up to tell her, he said. It's done telling. Let it rest where Tom put it. And we set Daniel's marker over the spot, so that the boy who never got a grave on his own ground finally had one, 60 years late, in the best light in the whole valley, watching over 1,100 acres of grass he'd loved from the other side of the world. Ruth we buried beside her Tom in the little plot by the creek, the way she'd asked. But it's the high ground I go to. I still farm my east line. Wade keeps the Calloway place, and he keeps the fence true, every post, the way Ruth taught him in the months she had, and he's good at it, better than I am, better maybe than anyone since Tom. He's not a drifter anymore. He's a rancher. The county knows his name. He married a schoolteacher from town 2 years back, and they've got a boy now. A small, loud boy who follows that old gray donkey around the yard like Solomon hung the moon. And Wade's teaching the boy the grass the way his daddy would have taught him, the way Daniel never got to teach a boy of his own. He named the boy Daniel. Of course he did. And me, I'm an old man now myself, older than I like, and most evenings when the work's done I drive over and climb the high south ground and sit by the marker in the best light of the day and watch the grass go blue. Sometimes Wade's boy comes up and sits with me. Sometimes Solomon comes up, ancient now, white all over, and stands at my shoulder breathing his warm hay breath into the dusk. And I think about an old woman who asked God for 2 years what her land was for, and a man who turned down an empty road for a donkey's water, and a tin box that waited 55 years in the dark for the one spring there'd be anyone left to understand it. I think about the man I was on October 3rd, with his green ledger and his patient greed, counting an old woman's days. I don't know how I got from him to here. I didn't decide it. It was done to me, slow, by people better than I was, and a donkey wiser than all of us, and a God I'd half stopped believing in who turned out to be in the business of turning trucks down empty roads after all. I keep my ledger still. There's a last line in it. I wrote it the evening after we set Daniel's marker, sitting up on the high ground in the blue light, and it's the only thing I've written in it since. I wrote she was right, he wasn't finished. And then under it, because I'm an old man and I've earned the right to wonder out loud, I wrote one more thing, and I'll leave you with it the way I left it on the page, because some things aren't ours to finish, only to witness. I don't think he's finished yet. The grass goes blue. Solomon turns his old white head toward the dark. And somewhere down at the gate, a small boy named Daniel is calling the donkey home.